It took the Americans 15 hours to fight their way back to the spot where the aid station had been, and when they finally reached it, they found a tent in ruins, a machine gun, and a man slumped over the machine gun who had been dead for some time. And then they started counting the bodies in front of him. They counted to 98. 98 enemy soldiers lying in a rough arc in front of a single gun, cut down at close range in the dark. And around the position, pressed into the torn ground, was something the men who found him would never forget: a blood trail. The gun had been moved, not once, several times. Each time a few yards, dragged to a new spot with a better angle, and each new spot ringed with its own pile of the dead. Whoever had been firing this gun had kept repositioning it as the enemy came, almost certainly while already dying, to keep his fire on the only thing that mattered to him, behind him, the path his wounded had taken when they crawled away to safety. The man on the gun wore a captain's bars. On his sleeve was a Red Cross armband, the mark of a man whose job, under the laws of war, was to heal and never to harm. His name was Ben Salomon, and before the United States Army ever handed him a rifle, Ben Salomon was a dentist. Benjamin Lewis Salomon was born on September 1st, 1914, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, into a Jewish family. He was, by every account, a gentle and gifted young man. He became an Eagle Scout. He went to Shorewood High School and then to college, and when he set his sights on the dental school at the University of Southern California, he ran into the kind of wall that thousands of Jewish students hit in 1930s America: quotas, caps on how many Jewish applicants a school would take. He fought his way in anyway. In 1937, he graduated and became a doctor of dental surgery, and he opened a practice and began, by all appearances, an ordinary and comfortable life fixing people's teeth. But Ben Salomon had been watching what was happening across the ocean. He saw what was beginning to happen to people who shared his faith in Europe, and the year he graduated, he tried to enlist in the American Army, and when that didn't work, in the Canadian one. Both turned him away. So he went back to his practice and waited. In 1940, the draft caught up with him, and the United States Army did something that would prove, in time, to be one of the more consequential clerical decisions of the war. It looked at a 36-year-old doctor of dental surgery and made him an infantry private. And the strangest thing happened. The dentist was a natural soldier. He qualified as an expert marksman with the rifle and the pistol. He took to infantry tactics so completely that the men around him said he was the best instructor in infantry they had ever had. He rose to sergeant and was put in charge of a machine gun section. And there, in the dust of a training camp, Ben Salomon found that he had a gift nobody had ever suspected. He understood, better than almost anyone, how to handle a machine gun. In 1942, the Army finally caught its own mistake. A man with a dental degree did not belong in a rifle company. He belonged in the Dental Corps. They commissioned him an officer and reassigned him to fix teeth. Ben Salomon tried to refuse. He asked to stay with his machine gun. The request was denied. He put on the Red Cross armband, and the single deadliest skill he possessed was quietly taken away from him. He kept it anyway. He just didn't know yet when he'd need it. In June of 1944, Captain Ben Salomon went ashore on the island of Saipan in the Marianas as the regimental dental officer of the 105th Infantry. It was the first combat he had ever seen. There is not much call for a dentist in the middle of a battle, so when the surgeon of the 2nd Battalion was wounded in a mortar attack, Ben Salomon volunteered immediately to take his place, to leave the relative safety of the dental work behind and become a front-line battalion surgeon, the man the wounded are carried to. He set up an aid station in a small tent about 50 yards behind the forward foxholes, close enough to the shoreline to hear the surf. On the night of July 6th, word came down the line that the Japanese were going to attack. Everyone dug in. At 5 o'clock the next morning, the largest banzai charge of the entire Pacific War came out of the dark. Somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 Japanese soldiers threw themselves at the American line in a single massed wave. Their commander had given them an order before they came. Each man was to kill 10 Americans before he himself was allowed to die. They hit the 1st and 2nd battalions of the 105th and, through sheer weight of numbers, tore a hole straight through the perimeter. Within minutes, the wounded began pouring into Ben Solomon's tent. Men who could walk, walked. Men who could crawl, crawled. Men who could do neither were carried. 30 of them, packed shoulder to shoulder on the floor of a small canvas tent, while outside the rifle fire got closer and closer until it was no longer outside. The line had not just bent, it had broken, and the aid station, 50 yards behind where the line used to be, was now the front. A Japanese soldier came through the brush and into the tent and began bayoneting the wounded men where they lay. Ben Solomon grabbed a rifle from one of his patients and shot him dead. 2 more came through the entrance. He killed them too. 4 more crawled in under the tent walls, and in the few feet of space between the stretchers, the dentist fought them with everything he had. He kicked a knife out of one man's hand, shot another, bayoneted a 3rd, and drove the butt of the rifle into the 4th, who was finished off by a wounded soldier on the floor. And in that moment, standing in a tent full of men who could not run, with the enemy already coming through the walls, Ben Solomon understood exactly what was about to happen. He could not save the tent. He could only buy it time. He turned to his wounded and gave them an order. Get back to the regimental aid station. Walk, crawl, drag each other however you can. Go now. I'll hold them off until you're clear. Then he picked up a rifle and went out the front of the tent, alone, toward the thousands of men coming the other way. Outside, a machine gun stood with its crew dead around it. 4 men had tried to hold this spot, and 4 men had been killed doing it. Ben Solomon stepped over them and got behind the gun. And the dentist they had forbidden to carry a weapon, the machine gun sergeant they had turned into a healer, did the one thing in all the world he had been best at from the very beginning. He held the line by himself. How long he fired, no one will ever know exactly. The Americans had pulled back, and contact with Solomon was lost for 15 hours while the battle raged across that ground and slowly turned back the other way. But the evidence he left behind tells the story without a single witness. He did not stay in one place and die. He moved. The blood trail showed it. The gun dragged from position to position, each move a few yards, each move buying a little more time for the men crawling away behind him. The wounds on his body would later show that many of them were taken while he was still alive and still fighting. He was being killed by inches, and with each inch he gave, he made the enemy pay, and he kept the muzzle pointed away from the path his patients had taken. When the Americans finally retook the ground and found him, the 30 wounded men he had sent to the rear had made it. Every yard he'd bought with that gun had been spent on them, and it had been enough. 98 of the enemy lay in front of him. Ben Solomon was 30 years old. He had been a soldier in active combat for less than a month, and a healer for most of his adult life. And in the end, he had been both at once. A doctor who killed an army to keep a tent full of dying men alive. The man who found his body was the division's own historian. He understood at once that he was looking at one of the most extraordinary individual stands of the entire war. And he gathered the eyewitness accounts and wrote up a recommendation for the Medal of Honor. It was denied. Not because anyone doubted what Ben Solomon had done. The denial came back for a reason that was, in its own way, almost unbelievable. Captain Solomon had worn a Red Cross armband. He was a member of the medical service. And under the Geneva Convention, to which the United States is a signatory, a medical officer is not permitted to bear arms against the enemy. It did not seem to matter that the very same convention allows medical personnel to take up weapons in the defense of themselves and their patients, which is the only thing Ben Salomon had ever done. The paperwork said no. The most decorated act on that whole stretch of beach went unrewarded because the man who performed it had been wearing the wrong armband. They tried again after the war. In 1951, the recommendation was resubmitted, and it came back unapproved. This time because the deadline for World War II awards had passed. They tried again in 1969. It was returned without action. For more than half a century, the dentist who had killed 98 men to save 30 had nothing to show for it but a grave. It was a fellow dentist who finally refused to let it go. A man from Ben Salomon's own school at USC took up the cause in the 1990s, gathered the records, found the supporters, and pushed it through every door that had been shut. On May 1, 2002, 58 years after Ben Salomon died on that machine gun, President George W. Bush stood in the Rose Garden of the White House and finally awarded Captain Ben L. Salomon the Medal of Honor. He remains one of only 3 dental officers in American history to receive it. The medal hangs today in the dental school he fought his way into as a young man, in a country that took 2 generations to find the words for what he'd done. He could have left with the others. That is the thing to hold on to. When Ben Salomon ordered his wounded to crawl for the rear, nothing in the world said he had to stay behind. He was the doctor. He could have gone with them. Instead, he picked up a gun he wasn't allowed to carry and walked out the front of the tent toward thousands of men, so that 30 of his patients could have the head start that he would not. They went home. He didn't. 98 of the enemy never got up. And for 58 years, the only people who knew the whole truth of it were the men he saved, who lived the rest of their lives because a dentist decided that the laws of war could wait until his patients were safe.